So welcome back. Thanks for coming back to video 2. If you haven't watched the first video, then go watch that, because what I talk about in this video will make more sense in light of that video. So yeah, in the first video, we spoke about how the world's in a bit of a mess right now, and how I think we need to go back to a lot of the basics in terms of the way we think about our decisions and what the end goal is there. And I came up with 3 sort of fundamental values which help me direct the decisions in my life to get to that end goal. The first one was minimizing suffering. The second one was maximizing flourishing. And the third one was, this is the one I always forget, preserving the possibility for future flourishment. So yeah, in this video, I just want to go into each of those specific values a bit more, go into a bit more of a deep dive and explain a bit more what I mean about each one, and also why it's not so simple, why the framework doesn't really translate that well into real life, explaining some contradictions and nuances to it. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so starting with minimizing suffering. What exactly do I mean by minimizing suffering? Well, it sounds pretty obvious at first, minimizing the amount of suffering in the world. But obviously there are different types of suffering. For example, you have physical suffering, emotional suffering, psychological suffering. And what does this look like in the real world? Well, for example, reducing physical suffering could look like eliminating, ideally, world hunger, or ending wars. For example, ending the war in Iran right now. That would be a very tangible, practical way of reducing suffering. So what are some examples of emotional suffering? Well, you have grief, you have anxiety, you have like depression and mental health. That all comes under emotional well-being and suffering. And you also have psychological, which is more like meaninglessness, I suppose, and feeling like there's a lack of purpose. So yeah, there are different types of suffering, and this is also the case for flourishing. There are different types of flourishing. For example, you have like very basic examples of flourishing, which is having good health, having a home, shelter, having security, having access to food and water. These are like the fundamentals of flourishing, which I suppose is having a good life. You have those basic ones, which I've just outlined, and then you have more sort of, I guess, luxury versions of flourishing, which could look a bit more like pleasure. So feeling happy, feeling content, and having enjoyable experiences. There's also like love and friendships and relationships and having a purpose in life. And those are all examples of flourishing, doing well in life, living well. So it's not just about reducing suffering, but also about living well. And a bit like suffering, yes, there are different types of flourishing, but there's also a bit of a hierarchy as well, which is useful because then we can start to prioritize different versions of both suffering and flourishing. So for example, I mentioned that there were more basic levels of flourishing, such as having good health and having shelter. In my mind, those are more important than having the luxuries of pleasure and enjoyment. So now that we realize that there are different levels to both suffering and flourishing, this can help us where there are contradictions between one version of flourishing and another. And by assigning a priority and a hierarchical system to these values, we can make the decisions easier when we're choosing between them, basically. So for example, if I was presented with a thought experiment, I guess, of whether I could minimize someone's physical suffering or their psychological suffering, I think I would place more value on trying to minimize their physical suffering. And I'm not sure really if that can be explained as to why, but to me it just feels intuitive. It feels like an intrinsic part of my, I guess, moral system. And that's subjective at the end of the day. That depends on each person. And that's partly part of the nuance that I want to talk about. So yeah, this is subjective. Everyone will have their different opinions on what values they deem more important than others. And that's for suffering and flourishing. So the next problem I want to talk about in respect to my original 3 fundamental values is the fact that sometimes these values may contradict each other. So for example, sometimes minimizing suffering can contradict maximizing flourishing, or vice versa. A good example of this is that going to the gym, though sometimes painful and can be seen as a version of suffering, in the long run is good for you and will benefit you and will maximize your flourishing. one version of minimizing suffering can also contradict another version of minimizing suffering. So, for example, distributing food parcels in a really remote area that's in need of humanitarian support can be uncomfortable and can cause temporary anxiety and distress. So, do you see how they're both versions of minimizing suffering, but one is clearly taking precedence over the other? And again, this is the case for flourishing. So some versions of flourishing can contradict other versions of flourishing. For example, stability versus growth. Both examples of flourishing, stability and growth, but often they contradict each other. So someone who values growth will have less stability and take more risks and step out of that comfort zone, whereas someone who favors stability more will value being more assured and know what they're getting in life. And finally, both values 1 and 2, so minimizing suffering and maximizing flourishing, can both contradict the third value, which is to preserve the possibility for future flourishment. Sometimes you have to have short-term suffering in order to get long-term flourishing. And that's a big thing in politics, especially with like renewable energy and topics like that. There is an immediate cost to our suffering and our potential flourishing in pursuit of maximizing flourishing down the line for future generations. So hopefully you can see how sometimes there are contradictions between values themselves as well as within values. So you're flourishing to your suffering, you're flourishing to flourishing, and both your suffering and flourishing to flourishing down the line. And this creates basically priorities. So each person will have their own priorities in which one they want to maximize. And this leads me to my important point about autonomy, which is sort of like a +1 fundamental value. If I was to add anything to my 3 I talked about in the first video, it would be autonomy. Basically, the ability for every individual to choose which values they prioritize the most. And this is something that in our ideal world, we want to strive towards. That everyone has the maximum amount of options available to them, the ability to choose which of those options they want to pursue, and the means to actually enact those values which they've decided are the most important to them. I hope that makes sense. So it's about being able to have the option of comfort, meaning, belonging, and being able to decide for themselves which of those things they want to pursue on top of maybe another value. And then thirdly, being able to actually physically enact that value in real life, which is something which is often hindered, especially when you think of, I don't know, dictatorships, where people may have values that they want to act out but aren't able to because of censorship or literally a physical stopping them of doing that thing. So I hope that makes sense. And I basically just wanted to show that I recognize that my very basic framework that I talked about in the first video is not that transferable to real life. It's more of an ideal, it's more of a concept. And in real life, things are much more nuanced. There are trade-offs, there are contradictions, and people have to set their own priorities really as to which values they deem more important than others. Some of it is slightly more obvious, but also some of them are really objective. And the most important thing is that we allow people to decide for themselves and give them the means to enact those values that they place importance on. And that's not to say that the original framework I talked about in video 1 is completely useless. It definitely is still useful because let's say we identify and recognize that there are trade-offs between which values we want to choose from. We can then go back to the original framework and say, okay, but what's going to have the greatest outcome here? Is a little bit of suffering going to produce much more flourishing? Or maybe the suffering is too much, so it doesn't warrant the potential flourishing that it could bring about. So again, it's nuanced, but you can think of it relatively and use the original framework to help you weigh up the trade-offs, basically. So yeah, I hope this video has sort of explained a bit more about what I meant by each of the original values, the limitations to that framework that I completely recognize. And again, this is just my thought process and the way I go about making decisions and guiding my life in the right way. Not everyone has to agree with it, but I'm intrigued to see how it differs for other people and what they think of it. But yeah, before I moved on, I just wanted to acknowledge the limitations, discuss them, and discuss also why you can still work with them and why the framework is still useful. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Hope you've somewhat enjoyed my ramble on those points. Thanks for listening. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.